Okay, in Ottawa, Leah West is an assistant professor at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. She previously worked as a national security lawyer in the Department of Justice. Wesley Wark is a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance and Innovation. He previously served 2 terms on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on National Security from 2005 to 2009. Professors, thank you very much for joining me. Professor West, I'd like to start with you if I could. I was struck this morning when this news was breaking. You said you don't see this as meeting the threshold for invoking the Emergencies Act. Did the Prime Minister or his ministers change your mind with what they had to say?
Well, David, the first thing I
Professor West. Professor West, please.
So the first thing I would say, David, is that
Professor Wark, just hold on a second.
So David,
I'm asking Professor West because she opposed this earlier. Go ahead, Professor West.
Oh, sorry, Leah.
I would say nothing I heard today changed my concern about meeting the threshold. Minister Lemeni did a good job of reiterating what the threshold was, and it is a very high threshold. But he didn't explain how the facts on the ground line up with those thresholds. And that's a concern for someone from a rule of law perspective. I'm not necessarily suggesting that the government of Canada doesn't have the information or the intelligence or evidence to say that we are now in a position where the government doesn't have the capacity to defend the security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Canada. That's essentially what they've said. But I'd like to understand why that's the case. And I also don't necessarily think we've seen evidence, at least publicly, and maybe we'll get it tomorrow, that the public order emergency threshold has been met, which requires that the emergency stem from a threat to the security of Canada. That's a defined term and only includes 4 things, which are subversion, espionage, sabotage, and terrorism or foreign influence. Again, they didn't speak to how that threshold has been met. And so that's where my key concerns are, because the thresholds for invoking this act are very high because of the powers the government gets as a result of invoking it.
And Professor West, just to follow up on that, looking at it from the outside, a bridge that $400 million worth of goods goes across every single day. 8,000 auto workers were temporarily laid off because of that disruption. 1,500 retail workers in the downtown core of Ottawa at the Rideau Centre alone. I mean, that all stacks up. So how does that, plus Coots, plus Emerson, plus everything, how does that not reach the threshold? Why does that fall short in your view?
Well, I'm not saying that it necessarily does, but economic insecurity and instability certainly affects our national interest, but the specific threshold is that it affects the security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of this country, and also that there are no other acts of Canada that would allow the government to respond to that threat. And again, both of those thresholds need to be met, and that threat needs to stem from a threat to the security of Canada. So again, that needs to be subversion, terrorism, espionage of foreign influence. It can't be from any thing. That's not what the law requires. And so that's why I would like to see more specifically on how these thresholds are met. Certainly, it has been massively disruptive. And my students who live downtown and tell me about what they're dealing with every day, I don't condone that. And certainly they have faced significant threat and disruption to their lives. But that's not the legal threshold for invoking the Emergencies Act. So what is it that meets that threshold and says that this emergency is caused by a threat to the security of Canada? That's what I didn't hear today.
Okay, and I don't want you to think my questions were suggesting you were minimizing the impact of all of this, because legal thresholds are important. I just wanted to understand where it fit in. And Professor Wark, if I could bring you in right now, because you are supportive of this move. You feel this is necessary and justified. Why do you feel that way?
I do feel it's necessary and justified. I would actually go so far as to say I think it's a bit belated as an exercise of federal power and responsibility for dealing with the scale of the protests that we've seen take place over the last couple of weeks. I agree with Leah absolutely that it is important for the government to demonstrate exactly how the situation has met the thresholds, and the thresholds are high in the public order emergency provisions of the Emergencies Act. And I have no doubt that the government thought very seriously about that and probably took its time. I think the critical considerations were being discussed over the weekend when the Critical Incident Response Group, the special committee of cabinet, met. But I think coming out of it, the key thing is that I think the use of the Emergencies Act meets the situation. It has become increasingly clear that neither the City of Ottawa and its authorities or the provincial government was able to fully deal with this crisis. It has become clear that I think that the existing legal powers provided to law enforcement agencies were not going to be sufficient. The Emergencies Act has some surgical tools that are quite unique, including declaring a protected area and preventing people from going in and out of it, essentially surrounding, ring fencing critical infrastructure for a limited period of time to prevent unlawful assembly and protest. And I think that's important. I think the legal threshold is high and justifiably so. I think the Emergencies Act is a last resort measure, but I think the federal government had to finally take responsibility for dealing with this crisis and use the Emergencies Act, which is the set of tools that it has to do.
Professor Wark, is that really what this is, though, is taking responsibility? Because the frustration in this city, for example, is that nobody is acting. Nobody is doing anything, and it's landing at the feet of the Prime Minister. So if he's going to wear it, he may as well take ownership of it. I mean, is this an emergency crisis situation, or is this a jurisdictional crisis that just required someone to take control?
Well, there's been a lot of buck passing, that's for sure, David. But the Prime Minister said in the press conference, as you heard, that it's a matter for the government to take responsibility for. I think he was right to say that. It's not enough just to say it, of course. It's not enough to say, well, Ottawa hasn't been able to deal with it. The province hasn't been able to deal with it. So now we will. The government is going to have to demonstrate very quickly that it is able to use the powers in the Emergency Act effectively. The clock is ticking. They have only 7 days after its invocation today to win parliamentary approval. They only have 30 days until the Emergencies Act expires. So they're going to have to show early success. So this is not just a rhetorical stance, but it's going to have to be a stance based on successful action and beginning to limit the protest in a staged and effective way.
Professor West, just a quick final point. Could they have done a lot of this with injunctions and just active enforcement in the downtown? Like Windsor was cleared after an injunction and local and provincial police moved in.
Well, I think the powers that were more appropriately should have been used were the provincial emergency powers. So a number of the surgical tools Wesley mentioned actually were available to the province, and the province chose not to use them. So such things like bringing in tow truck drivers and declaring areas no-go zones. We saw that happen in Toronto effectively over the weekend. It wasn't done in Ottawa, despite the same rules being enforced. So that again is my question: is was this necessary at the federal level? Again, that's debatable because almost all of the measures that they invoked today could have been done at the provincial level and weren't. The only ones being the financial measures that required that federal level of authority.
Okay, I want to thank you both for your expertise and your time. Leah West, Wesley Wark, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.